Welcome to the Art of Conscious Living. I'm so very, very pleased today to have as my guest Irene Kendig. She wrote the most incredible book that's getting rave reviews from all the best other authors, and the best-selling New York Times author, Neil Donald Walsch, Conversations with God. He totally embraces this book. And we're going to be speaking to Irene today about such subjects as heaven and hell, suicide, what it's like to be living a balanced, full, rich life, and so much more. Irene, thank you for being here today and taking time out of your very, very busy schedule.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And how are you today?
I am so thrilled to be here and to be sharing with you my delight with Conversations with Jerry and Other People I Thought Were Dead, the book that I wrote that came out last year.
Let's go back to the very beginning of this book. How did this book come about? And I understand that you worked with somebody very, very, very special person.
I did.
And it was a very time-intensive process to put this book together.
Yes. Well, back in 2006, I had just started a master's program in spiritual psychology. And about that time, a friend called, and she told me of this extraordinary woman who could communicate with people who had passed. And she asked if I would be willing to do a session because this woman wanted to make this her life's work. And I really hesitated because I had a lot on my plate, and even if she did have this extraordinary gift, there was no one I really wanted to talk to on the other side. So she sensed my hesitation, and she said she wouldn't charge anything. She would just want you to tell other people if you thought she was the real deal. And so I agreed to the session, thinking I was doing my friend a favor. I scheduled an appointment with this woman. Her name is Jana Anna. And I scheduled the appointment for Thursday. I was sitting in my home office on the futon. My dog Scooter was on one side, and I had a pad of paper and a pen on the other. And after we exchanged our hellos, she asked me to give her the first name of the person I'd wanted to speak to. I said, Biba. I didn't tell her that Biba was my mother, or that she had transitioned 3 years prior. So she began to describe my mother in very accurate terms. And then she said, does Biba like to play cards? Because she's playing cards and she says she's winning, she's laughing. My jaw dropped. If you knew my mother, she would practically greet you at the door with a deck of cards because she loved to play gin rummy. And some of our most profound conversations always took place over games of gin rummy. So my jaw dropped and I gasped. This is beyond what I expected. And then she said, does Biba have a daughter? And I'm my mother's only daughter. I said, yes, she does. And she said, she says that her daughter doesn't consider herself a good mother, and that's nonsense. And I reflected back to having my older son when I was 18 and still a teenager myself. And at that time, still feeling guilty about not being a good enough mother, which I've since healed. And then she said, do you have any questions you'd like to ask Biba? I was so flabbergasted that I just said, so how are you? And that was the beginning of 2 years. At the end of that session, I think I danced around my house for about 3 hours, knowing that we're eternal, because I spoke with 3 other people that day. And they all came through in a way that was irrefutable and unmistakable. And then I scheduled another session, and at the end of that session, I asked Jana if she would be interested in collaborating on a book. And she agreed. So we spent 1 hour a day, 5 days a week, for 2 years. She lives in Bloomington, Indiana. I live in Leesburg, Virginia. So these were all by phone. And I asked these 7 friends and family members who have transitioned the same question. What did you experience when you released your last breath on earth? And from there, each of the 7 dialogues takes goes in different directions, and they share their experience with me, and it's very illuminating.
So, unlike a lot of mediums, they talk from spirit world, the hereafter.
Mm-hmm.
But here we have proof that this person is really authentic. And by saying that in the title of the book, Conversations with Jerry, who is Jerry?
Well, Jerry was the husband of my best friend. He was a man who at the age of 9 had a transcendent experience, and he dedicated his life to God. When he was a young man, he studied as a Lutheran minister. And then he, in his later years, started traveling to Japan and studying with a Zen master there, a Zen master who's considered a national treasure in Japan. And so 3 weeks before he transitioned, he was ordained as a Buddhist priest. So he began as a Lutheran minister and ended as a Buddhist priest, which is quite a journey. And because he was so deeply spiritual, about a third of the book is our conversations with Jerry, and then the remaining 2/3 of the book is with the other 6 people.
So she was able to tell you about Jerry, to prove and to validate that this was Jerry, the person that
Yes,
you knew?
each person came through.
You did not tell her anything prior to who
No.
Jerry was?
No.
And she told you everything that you had just said here?
Yes.
Amazing.
Oh, she didn't tell me that he had begun as a Lutheran minister. She didn't tell me that story.
Okay.
But as she began talking and speaking on behalf of those people, things were said that were clearly, to me, indicators that I was speaking with those people on the other side, that she was somehow connecting and providing that information.
Well, the question that begs to be asked is it the people that are familiar with you that's why they were coming through this medium? Or could it just be any spirits coming through? And what does the medium say about that?
Well,
how long has she been doing this work?
Well, she had this gift when she was young, when she was a child. And then, like many people who have extraordinary gifts, she shut it down. Because, you know, children, they just want to be like everyone else. They just want to fit in. And so she shut it down, and it was only in later years. She's also does healing touch and massage therapy. So as she was working with clients, these messages would be coming through, and so she would be telling her clients as she was working with them what messages she was getting. And so now what she wanted to do, and the reason that this friend called me, was she wanted to specifically just do this work. And that's how we began.
So it's a natural gift that she has, and a natural process that was happening to her on a very innate level.
Yeah.
And she was born with this gift.
Yeah. And you know what really inspired me, Victoria, is that this is a woman who was so dedicated to serving spirit, to being accurate, and to being a bridge between the physical and the non-physical. She would spend 2 to 3 hours preparing for our session. She would center herself. She would ask to be of service and really grounding herself. And I was very inspired by her dedication to being accurate and to being in service to spirit and to humanity.
And Neil Donald Walsch, who is the New York Times bestseller author of Conversations with God, he has totally embraced this book. And he gave you a phone call and told you how happy it was that you wrote this book. So it's really, the two of them are very complementary. And it's the spirit, it's God talking to Donald Neil Walsch, and it's a Q&A. And he wrote 3 books over a 3-year period. And it was all about the no longer saying that Judeo-Christian, of the punishing God. Basically the message there was of love.
Yes.
God is of love, and God is experiencing us as we experience our love, we experience the divine energy. So in this book here that you've written, let's talk about what the concept of heaven and hell and what it is to really live a life here on this earth? And what choices do we have, or do we even know we have choices? And that's what I've learned from reading this book, that we do have choices. The spirits are saying, here, this is what is possible. And also, let's talk about the suicide here. Which person has committed suicide?
My friend Bill, who was in his 30s, committed suicide, and I was so grateful for these conversations because there's so much suffering in the world. People who have had a loved one commit suicide oftentimes are living with so much regret and grief that they could have or should have been able to do something to prevent it. And I think we all know somebody either who committed suicide or know of someone who knows someone. I was at Valley State Prison for Women back in 2008. I volunteered there as a part of the University of Santa Monica, where I earned my master's degree in spiritual psychology. There are a group of us who have been going to Valley State Prison for a number of years to share the principles and experiential practices of spiritual psychology. And the first day that I went, at the lunch break, we joined the women for lunch, and I was a little nervous, not because I was in a prison, but because at that time I still had some discomfort with being in social settings. And when we broke for lunch, there I found myself in a social setting. I just stopped. I was holding my sandwich, and I stopped, and I looked out on the yard where the women were, and I said, Spirit, show me where to sit. And I was directed to a woman who was sitting by herself. There was an empty seat next to her. And I walked over. She looked very depressed. And I sat next to her, and she told me that she'd been in isolation for 3 months because her 25-year-old son had committed suicide, and that her religion told her that he was burning in hell. And I said, you know, it's no accident that I'm sitting here. I'm in the process of writing a book, and I know this is going to sound strange, but I speak with 7 people who've died. And one of them is my friend Bill, and he committed suicide. Would you like to know what he said? And she said, oh, yes. And I began to share with her, first of all, that he wasn't penalized. There is no penalty for committing suicide. The penalty is you don't get to enjoy physical life. This is a gift, physical life. And so when one commits suicide, not only does one have to return eventually to handle the problems front and center that one was not willing to confront at the time, it's kind of like a timeout. Suicide is like a timeout. But you have to come back and you have to grow another body to maturity. It's time consuming, and we're never given more than we can handle. So in any case, I sent her, at that time they were typewritten sheets, and I sent her those typewritten sheets to the prison, and she wrote back to tell me that she had found great peace from reading them. Since then, she has read the entire book. The last time I was at the prison, she came up to me and she asked if we could have lunch. And she said, well, first of all, I want to tell you I'm in love with Jerry. And secondly, I've started a group within the prison called Survivors of Suicide. And we have 36 women who have all had a loved one commit suicide. And we use your book as a text. And I'm so grateful that these conversations are available. One of the things that Bill says is that when a person who's in a lot of pain and is contemplating suicide, what they've done is they've built walls to protect themselves. And what happens is that nobody can get through that wall unless that person decides to create an opening. So for example, I had a friend named Denise, and she was living with a lot of regret because she was supposed to have dinner with her brother, and she canceled, and he committed suicide. And she thought if only she'd been able to attend that dinner and be with him, she could have prevented it. And what Bill goes on to say in the book is, even if she had made that dinner, her brother still would have had to create the opening, would have been willing to let her her in. And had he not been willing to let her in, her showing up wouldn't have made any difference. But that when we do seek help, it's always available. So if a person who's contemplating suicide seeks help, Spirit always provides help in some form. Whether it's somebody who comes by and smiles or lifts that person or whatever it is. So it's important to know if people have had someone that they love commit suicide, to know that we are not responsible for anyone else, and that person had to have created the opening. So it absolves those people of having to live with guilt and regret, which is such a heavy burden to bear.
Well, let's go a little bit further with this. It's possible that within the last 10 years, there's a lot of movement, a lot of authors, and a lot of conversation about that. It's possible that even in negativity, even when bad things happen, even as such as suicide, that's at the end of the line. That's when all hope and all despair. But even before suicide, that it's possible to see this as an opportunity for growth, something positive. It's there to awaken us to our higher sense of self.
Absolutely.
And beingness.
Absolutely.
What a absolute idea that is.
Yes.
And what a concept that is.
Yes.
And what relief that is.
Yes. And in fact, that what we go on to talk about in these conversations is the idea that on a soul level, we choose all of the circumstances and experiences of our life for purposes of spiritual growth. And it's not that things are pre-planned. It's not that things are written in stone. It's that we, as souls, come to the earth to expand in consciousness, to discover our loving essence. Because at our essence, we are all the same, and we are all loving. At our essence, we are love, we're compassion, we're gratitude, we're generosity and kindness. And that essence is there no matter what, no matter your behaviors, no matter whether you're in prison, no matter what the circumstances of life, everyone at their core, at their essence, is loving. And then we come and we have these experiences and these challenges that help us grow. I, for example, was raped at the age of 24 with a shotgun to my head. Now, would I wish that experience on anyone? Absolutely not. But if I had it to do all over again, would I choose that experience? Yes. And the reason is what I learned from that. Because as a result of that experience, I had a connection with an experience of Christ consciousness and forgiveness that I perhaps never would have had otherwise. So sometimes the most painful of experiences and the things that challenge us the most become those opportunities that help us evolve in consciousness. So I know what it is to experience something that someone might, quote, call terrible. But if we take away the judgment that an experience is good or it's bad, what we're left with is, what can we learn from this? In the past, I used to ask the question, why did this happen to me? Why is God punishing me? Now I ask the question, what would my soul have wanted to learn from this? How can I grow from this? And those are questions that lead us in very different directions. The first, why is this happening to me and why has God punished me, it speaks to being a victim of circumstance. But what can I learn from this? What did my soul desire to learn is those are empowering questions that lead us to discover more of who we are and to use everything for our own upliftment and expansion. And that's very exciting.
So what I hear you say is that life is an experiential experience of a journey. And whether it's good or bad or whatever is happening, it's an experience. And we should not have judgment to it. We should not feel that we are in a wrong place or a bad place, or the story, this should not happen, or this should not have happened.
Yeah.
When we do that, we are completely not in the experience of our own life. We are locking ourselves in a moment of stopping. Life just stops at that moment in time.
Well, we create unnecessary suffering for ourselves when we judge. Because if what's happening is happening, and I have the judgment that it shouldn't be happening, I am now out of alignment with what is. And so whenever I'm going through life, one of the things I talk about in the book is compassionate self-forgiveness. You know, when I was raped, back when I was 24, back then, I reached a deep level of forgiveness for that man, so that I had no scar from the experience, no scarring. It really, I was free of blame, of remorse, of guilt, of anything like that.
Was it a process that you had to go through to get to that place of acceptance?
It happened pretty quickly because I had this experience of Christ consciousness. I had this experience where it was a direct experience from Christ of what forgiveness is, of letting it go. Now,
and that was because of that event of the rape?
I assume so, because they were very connected.
How long after did that happen?
About a month.
A month.
About 3-4 weeks, something like that. Today, given what I've learned about forgiveness, I would say, today I wouldn't need to forgive him. And the reason is that we come to the earth and we don't know what circumstances will best facilitate our soul's expansion and growth. We don't know. Maybe it's being raped. Maybe it's being in prison. We don't know what circumstances will further our growth. So how can we judge what's good or what's bad? We can't. And so the only thing I forgive now are my judgments for presuming that I know what's best, or what circumstances will best allow for you to grow or for me to grow. I can't know that. You take somebody like Viktor Frankl, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning, a Jewish psychiatrist who was imprisoned in a concentration camp. And this is a man who found a way to access compassion for his captors. And in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, he says, everything can be taken from a man but one thing, and that's the freedom to choose our response to life, regardless of circumstance. So when I'm in the prison with the women, and there's 70 of us from the University of Santa Monica, holding a space, knowing who we are, that at our essence, we are divine beings having a temporary human experience, and so are these women. We're all the same divine essence. I've seen so many women stand up in a group, and there are 300 women in the room, and say, I'm so grateful to be in prison, because it's here that I have now discovered my divinity. And then outside, I was so busy trying to survive, I didn't know who I was. But in this space, in this workshop, in the work that you're doing here, I now know that I too am divine, and I'm having a human experience, this time in prison.
For those who are listening to us and they are saying, I cannot do that, I cannot embrace that thought of this terrible action that has happened to me, how would you address that?
Well,
what would you say to that person, actually?
Look, these are really challenging concepts to embrace. It is a challenge, because when we are seeing life through our limited human vision, it's our tendency to judge. This is good, this is bad, this is right, this is wrong, this shouldn't have happened, he shouldn't have said that, I should have said this, all of those things. But when we gain altitude and we look from the soul's perspective, the soul doesn't judge the experience. And so it one has to, if one is to gain altitude, one has to begin to look and see from the soul's perspective without judgment, which brings such deep levels of peace. And I wish I could share it with everyone, what it's like to move through life in a state of peace. Because the moment I find myself triggered by an upset, the first thing I do is I look for what is the judgment that I've placed on myself, on someone else, on the situation. And then I forgive myself. I say, I forgive myself for judging that. I know what's best for that person.
So is there something practical that people could apply that would give them measured results, that they would be able to walk this path of what we're speaking about is basically of inner peace, but it's also the greatest amount of freedom that can be known to man. What practicality, what is there in practicality that would be able to offer that to the people that are saying, I cannot do this?
Yeah. A couple of things is, one is, I would say that, you know, it's not what happens to us, but the way we interpret what happens to us that really has an impact. So if people can notice their interpretation, what's the story they've told themselves about, say, a traumatic event? This was bad. This shouldn't have happened. I'm a victim of this. They have the power. I have no power. These are all interpretations. And if we can start to become aware of and distinguish the event from how we interpreted the event, then we can start to gain some freedom. That's number one. And then to start to look at the judgments that we've placed. And, you know, as a soul-centered coach, I facilitate people in seeing these situations and seeing life from the soul's perspective and releasing judgment, so people can learn and grow from these opportunities, as painful as they may be, but to take it and make something of it that will forward that person.
So you are a soul-centered coach.
Yes.
And that would mean that you are looking at the macro, the big picture.
Exactly.
Not the small picture of the pain and the reactiveness from that pain, but what is possible to do with this pain.
Right.
And therefore you can have the most incredible life that can't even be imagined.
Yes.
If you allow this journey to unfold for you.
Yes.
What is it like to be a soul-centered
it's such an
coach?
honor.
And what have you seen in the way of your clients?
Well, it's such an honor to be able to facilitate someone's process, to be a witness, because I believe that everyone has within them the resources necessary to experience their own loving essence. And so I was recently, for example, working with a man who had been caring for his dying father, and he had left to run some errands at one point. And while he was gone, his father transitioned. And so the man was filled with remorse and guilt that he had left, because he felt he should have been there when his father transitioned. And so we looked at several things. One is that the assumption that his father would have wanted him to be there. How do we know that his father would have wanted him to be there? We don't know that. My Aunt Paula, who I write about in this book, who was an octogenarian who transitioned in her sleep, said she preferred no one being there because she'd always been viewed as strong, and she didn't want to be seen in what she considered a vulnerable position. And so I suggested to him the possibility that, like my aunt, his father may have even waited for that moment when he left so that he could transition. Secondly, I asked him, what do you think your soul would have wanted you to learn from this experience? And he said, to listen to myself and the whisperings of my soul. I said, isn't that a wonderful gift that your father left you? And to be able to appreciate that and carry that forward that's a gift from your Father. And lastly, there's always an assumption that we make. No matter what people are regretting, in this case, he was regretting that he hadn't been there when his father died. But no matter what we regret, if we look underneath, what we'll find, if we want to free ourselves from regret, there's always an assumption. And the assumption is that whatever it is we didn't do that we thought we should have, we think that would have turned out better. The mind assumes that would have turned out better, but we don't know that. And that's a huge assumption. And so when people that's kind of the linchpin, the assumption that that would have been better if I had been there with my dad. We don't know that. That's a big assumption. So if we let that go, the guilt can go, one can release the regret, and one can again begin to reconnect with that loving essence, get out of the judgment.
What is the main difference between conventional therapy and a soul-centered coach?
Well, I would say that as a soul-centered coach, what I do is I listen with compassion, with my entire being. There's nothing for me to fix. There's nothing wrong with the person who I'm working with. They are a divine being, and that's how I see them. I see their divinity. And then, when they present their challenge, whatever they're challenged with, I hold that space and allow them, with certain questions and so forth, to uncover the misinterpretation they've made, or to look at things without judgment, or to release judgment. I work with people often who have, early on in childhood, decided that they weren't worthy, that they were unlovable, and to be able to go back to those events, as I said, it isn't the event that happens, it's the way we interpret an event. And so to be able to look at the event and be discerning about it, so that that person can see, oh, I was just a child trying to do the best I knew how to do, and I came to the conclusion that I was unworthy or unlovable, but that was never really the case. It was just a child misinterpreting.
So quite simply, you are removing the obstacles that are blocking love that is already there.
Beautifully said. Or facilitating that person in removing their own blockage so that they can experience their own loving essence and divinity.
What would you hope that the book that you have written here that can be helping others, or the best that could be accomplished by writing this book?
Well, you know, I've had, first of all, it's the kind of book that people read and then they read it again and they read it again. I've had people tell me that this is the book that they're going to be reading for the remainder of the decade, because every time they read it, there's something new. It provides a profound sense of peace. People have told me they feel very peaceful as they read it. And it's the kind of book people want to share with other people. So when somebody's read it, they come back and buy 2 or 3 copies. I've had several people come back and buy a case of books, 24, to hand out to all the people that they love. Because what it does is, more than just a good read, it almost has an energetic quality to it that is transformative. And the reader begins to not only release their fear of death, but to illuminate their own life and to see, where are they holding judgment? Where can they release? How can they experience more of their divine self? And I think it inspires people to what's possible.
And so what is the book actually about in the way it speaks about spirit? And spirit is talking about the hereafter.
Yes.
What can you tell us about that? And
Well,
what can one expect?
Yes. Well, when I asked the question, what did you experience when you released your last breath on earth? Each person takes me on a journey. And to give you an example, Jerry says that he practically melted out of his body. He was very much at peace with dying. He said he practically melted out of his body. In fact, if I can read you
Absolutely.
the passage where he describes it, It's quite beautiful. He says, I kept breathing, but my body wasn't responding. My release was gentle. I practically melted out of my body. I felt cold just before losing consciousness in my physical body, and then warm again as I transitioned into non-physical form. It was different from feeling warmed by an outside source, because this warmth came from within. I was surprised that I kept breathing. I thought breathing was limited to the physical body. You kept breathing? It surprised me too. Breath is a function of life, and the nature of life is expansion. It's the nature of life to expand itself into greater and more creative versions of itself. Now, if you contrast that with Jared, who was my son's best friend, who transitioned at the age of 30, who was in a tremendous amount of pain, taking morphine, had injured his back and had unsuccessful surgeries. And so here's what he says. Jared, what did you experience when you released your last breath on earth? I was shot out of my body like a bullet out of a gun, but I was ready. I was chomping at the bit to be released. I'd been miserable for a long time. Was it painful? No, there was no pain. It felt like my physical body blew me out like an air gun. I didn't have any regrets about leaving my physical body. I was done with it. As I hovered 3 or 4 feet above it, I noticed how sickly it was in contrast to how good I felt, better than I'd felt in a long time. You see, that's a very different experience in terms of one is melting out of their body, one is being shot out of their body, but it's all unique to each individual and quite extraordinary. My friend Bill, who committed suicide, has a completely different experience. I say, Bill, what did you experience when you released your last breath on earth? He says, I was laughing. I looked at my body and laughed that I ever could have taken myself so seriously. I realized I was laughing and wondered how I could be laughing. Isn't laughter for bodies? I stopped. I realized that laughter comes from the soul. Who is looking at the body that I thought was me? I had killed Bill, but I was still alive. I still felt like me, like Bill, but lighter. I wondered where the heaviness had gone. Had it stayed in my physical body? I looked at my face and I could see the pain I'd just been through. My mouth and eyes were open. That's when I started laughing. I realized that I wasn't my physical body.
Is there any mention of spirit guides or
yes.
loved ones or familiar people that they have
Absolutely.
known in their life that meet them as they're
Yes.
transitioning?
Everyone that I spoke with was greeted by either a loved one or loved ones. We're not limited to just one person who can greet us.
Or if they choose to have no one,
That's right.
there
And
will
it
be no
really-
one there.
Yes, and it really is up to us. It really is up to us. We are the creators of our experience in physical reality and in non-physical reality. But this is a loving and beneficent universe, and we have free will. So if someone expects to experience hell, they will. But eventually, they bump up against the loving and beneficent universe that we're living in. So they have free will, and they can experience hell if that's what they believe. It's, even in physical world reality, what we experience is very much a function of what we believe. And that's why it's so important to forgive ourselves now, as we're going through life, for the things that we judge. It's so important to find our loving essence now so that our transition can be the most beautiful and loving possible. And as we transition, it's important to keep in mind the most loving thoughts that we can hold as we're making that transition. But it's, all of the 7 people, the conversations are so uplifting. And we are so loved and so cared for. And that's what you come away with.
So if one is to ponder on the question, why are we here? Why were we born? What is this life all about? from your book and your perspective, it is about having an experience, connecting with the love that we are, and sharing that love with others. And if we are not doing that, we have to come back again to learn that process of what it is like to be in the experiential of complete love and openness without judgment, the purity of our beingness of who we are. And if we are not in that balance, then we have to come back here to learn this.
Not necessarily.
So perhaps that is a judgment in itself too.
Yeah, not necessarily. I think that the reason we're here is to evolve in consciousness. We're here, and I would also say this, most people, I think that we're here to change the world. I would say it differently. I would say the world is here for us to expand in consciousness, that the circumstances, exactly as they are and exactly as they are not, are divinely guided. And so we have the opportunity to heal and to experience the truth of who we are. And yet every experience is designed for our learning. It's up to us to take that learning.
And being that we have free will, and if we choose not to take that because we don't know through ignorance,
that's okay too.
That's okay.
Jerry says there's no wrong way to do life. Isn't that freeing?
Mm-hmm.
There's no wrong way to do life. If you don't learn from this time, you'll learn another time. It's all free choice. What do you choose? How do you want to move through the world? And this is a playground for us. And we can do with it as we choose.
The topic reincarnation, has anything been mentioned of this?
Oh yes. And Jerry talks specifically about the process for choosing the next life. That we actually, as souls, preview the life that we're living. Not to say that it's, again, not written in stone, but that we choose the circumstances that are best going to support our evolution. That may mean choosing abusive parents where we're abused. Because maybe, for example, or let's say a child comes into the world and is abandoned by their parents, feels abandoned. Well, maybe what that soul came to learn is to heal abandonment. And so those conditions are necessary to be put into place so that soul can then heal that later on in life. We each have a curriculum. We each have something, we have the things we've come to learn. And that's why we can't judge the circumstances I mentioned earlier, because we don't know what circumstances are best going to support anyone.
So is there a continuum of learning, or does it stop when we die? Or is it continuing from one life to another?
We are evolving
to learn
eternally. Evolving eternally. You know, at the same time that I totally relax into the fact that we are eternal. And you know, when I first started writing the book, Victoria, I was 95% sure that we go on. There was always that nagging doubt. Now, not only is there no nagging doubt, and not only am I 100% sure, but it's the difference between thinking that we're eternal and knowing we're eternal.
So you say we're 100% sure.
I'm sure.
You're sure, 100%.
100%.
How do you know this? 100%?
I know it deep. I know it in the deepest of places. It's no longer up here. I know as a soul. I know it. And so...
it's not an analytical, logical
mind
thing. It's more of a gut feeling that you
knowing.
Just know.
It's a knowing. It's a knowing. And the freedom that comes from that. You know, in our culture, we're so afraid to talk about death and dying, and you know, we're so youth-oriented, and you know, we also have judgments. You know, people shouldn't die young. Well, according to who? Maybe they completed their curriculum in 25 years, or Jared in 30 years. We don't know. We can't know. And therefore, there is no specified amount of time that one is supposed to be here. One is here the perfect amount of time necessary to complete one's curriculum. And for a woman, for example, I had a miscarriage. And I remember, many years ago, I remember thinking that I had done something wrong to cause that miscarriage. And in these conversations, we talk about not only miscarriage, but abortion. And that it is an agreement between the mother and the soul of the child and the entire family, who will all learn and grow from the experience. And so there are souls who come in just in, for brief time. They aren't even physically born. And that was appropriate for them. So that as women who have had miscarriages or abortions, we can let that go and trust that it was all in divine order. And I know that's a difficult concept for many to get, but there, as Jerry would say, there are no victims. We are all powerful creators. Powerful, powerful creators.
Irene, you mentioned the experience of rape, and that experience was very transformational for you. Before you wrote this book, what were you like? Were you of the beautiful person you are today with all of this understanding? Or did you learn during the process of writing the book? What belief system did you have before you wrote the book? Was it akin to the book, or did you change your thoughts along the way of the journey of writing the book?
Yeah. Well, I had done a lot of healing work. So I'd already done, I'm an alchemical hypnotherapist and an NLP practitioner, and I'd gone through some deep processes for healing those wounds that were still causing me difficulty. But when I began writing this book, I also began a 2-year master's program in spiritual psychology that's very experiential. And in that program, we heal wounds for the last time. And so, while I had done a lot of work, the master's program, in combination with the transformation that the book provided, took me to such a deep level that now I live now from that place. Before, I would now and again touch on that place of peace and compassion and joy and knowing who I am at my core. I would touch on it now and then. After writing the book and after the master's program, I know how to live from that place, how to come from that place, how to release the things that no longer serve me, so that I can move through the world in a way that reminds other people who they are, that they too share the same loving essence, no matter what they've done.
So it was a beautiful process to become who you are today.
Yes.
And this journey of who you are today, that a complete wide open acceptance, a large focal point of openness instead of closed or selected thinking. It's very much there in the moment of openness.
Absolutely. You know, the other day I was walking out of my house to go to get the mail. It's at the corner at the mailbox. And as I was coming out of my house, there was a dark-skinned man across the street in Caddy Corner who waved at me. And I turned around to see if he was waving at someone behind me, because I didn't recognize the man. And I went, and he waved again. And so I said, okay, and I waved back. And as I began walking to the corner, to the mailbox, he began walking toward me. And as he got closer, I thought, oh, I know who that is. That's the man from India who loves to take long walks with his wife around the neighborhood. And as I got closer, I noticed that he had lost a lot of weight. And I said, you've lost a lot of weight. And as he came forward to me, I realized it wasn't the man I thought it was. It was a stranger. And he said, I just found out I have cancer. Now this is a stranger walking toward me saying, I just found out I had cancer. And without skipping a beat, because I'm in service to spirit. That's the greatest way to go through life, is in service. And so I looked at him, and spirit just worked right through me and said, through my voice, the question then to ask isn't, how are you going to heal the cancer? The question is, how is the cancer going to heal you? And he stopped and he said, that really is the question, isn't it? And I said, yes, because you have the opportunity. Sometimes what it takes for us to really appreciate and squeeze the juice out of every moment is to remember that this life is finite. We are eternal beings, but this physical life is brief. And so to be able to enjoy each moment, to bring your best into each moment, and to heal the wounds that keep you from experiencing your loving essence. This is the work that we are here to do.
You mentioned spirit. What do you feel spirit is? It's a word that is used and misused. What is your understanding of spirit?
Well, the origin of the word spirit comes from spirare, which means in Latin, breathe, breath. So with every inhalation, we are taking in the oneness. With every exhalation, we are contributing to the oneness. So it's the breath. It's the breath.
The continuum.
Yes.
The embracing
life.
Everything,
yes,
as it is, without
as
judgment,
is, without judgment,
without adding a story on it.
Yes.
Witnessing it and being open to that experiential of
yes.
whatever.
And when we're triggered by something, rather than blaming the people who triggered us, to take ownership, that was my reaction. I'm responsible for that reaction. What do I need to heal that reaction so that instead of reacting, I can respond? So often when we're triggered by someone, we blame them. They're the cause. We need to change them. And that disempowers us because that gives them all the power. Now we've got to work to change our circumstance, to change that person that we're in relationship with. No, it's the opposite. When they trigger us, they're in service to us. They're showing us where are the places inside ourselves that we need to heal. That's a very different orientation.
Were you ever on the other side of the fence many years ago?
Oh,
where
I blamed my mother for decades. I thought she was responsible for that, how I was and how I turned out. And I didn't like who I was. So it was my mother who was responsible.
So
I blamed her.
Experience
Oof.
where that can bring you a lot of
Suffering,
turmoil and suffering and a lot of discomfort.
Oh my gosh.
And now you've arrived to this other way of being, and this is arriving with much, much more peace and much more openness and much more positive results.
Absolutely. And I used to have, Victoria, such a critical inner dialogue. I would be so critical of myself, And so we can all learn. I'm telling you, those are the opportunities that, I know a woman. I say that outer experience is a reflection of inner reality. What we're experiencing on the outside is a reflection of what's going on inside. So I have a woman that I know who chose to take responsibility for the terrorism in the world by healing the terrorism within herself. The critical way she talked to herself, the mean things she said to herself. She started to heal that in service to healing terrorism out in the world. Because all we can do really is impact right here.
Absolutely. Irene, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. This is very, very profound work that you are sharing, and your book is absolutely beautiful, and thank you for writing this book.
Thank you so much, Victoria, for having me, for allowing me to share these things that are so near and dear to my heart.
What final thoughts would you like to share that is very dear to you?
Yes, that We are all divine beings having a temporary human experience rather than human beings with spirits. And that we can use everything that upsets us as rungs on a ladder to evolve in consciousness and to experience our own divine essence. That everything is divinely guided and happening for our highest good if we will but learn from the experiences that we have and ask the questions that empower us.
Very beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you. From the Art of Conscious Living, do take care of yourselves. Lots of love.